And when Brexit came, the months leading up to Brexit, it was clear that the media, the mass media in part, were so focused upon the leaderships of the two campaigns that they didn't really understand what was unfolding in the country. The level of anger that had been developed against both political parties.
Vic Seidler is an emeritus professor in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London. Of his latest book, Making Sense of Brexit, Craig Calhoun of the Berggruen Institute notes that Vic Seidler offers insight into a wide range of issues from gender to immigration, class to the emotional side of politics. His book will remain valuable for years to come as the country struggles to understand just what is happening. And British Member of Parliament John Cruddas praises that the book acts as an antidote to the twin dangers of nationalism and isolation. It is both the generosity and passion we will require to navigate the cross-currents of Brexit. Please join me in welcoming Vic Seidler.
Well, it's just wonderful to be here. Where you speak makes a difference to how you speak. And I love this bookstore. And I've known this bookstore for 40 years. So just the possibility of being able to make sense together about these historical events that we are all living through. So when I wrote, or in the process of writing Making Sense for Brexit, I didn't think that I was providing a kind of solution or an answer as to why it happened. But I understood the kind of process of making sense as something which is a kind of collective project and a reminder of the values that a number of the people in this room, going back to the early 1970s, basically lived. So the idea that we somehow live our values and that those values are not simply in the past, but those values are important resources in the present in order to question a kind of neoliberal globalized culture. And it's been very clear in Britain, particularly since the financial crisis of 2008, that conditions and expectations, particularly of a younger generation, have changed dramatically. And I remember I was teaching at Goldsmiths in 2009, and in that 1 year there was a radical shift of atmosphere, a sense that the students were not going to be able to have the kinds of jobs, the kinds of futures that their older brothers and sisters had taken for granted. And at that moment, and since that moment, there's been the opening up of a conversation across generations, and a kind of questioning that didn't happen for almost like 20 or 30 years, where people were saying, well, how did you organize? What was it like in the 1970s? There were certain early aspects in the women's movement and the gay liberation movement that made connections between the personal and the political, the personal and the structural relations of power, that have somehow become relevant in a different way to a new generation. So I'm going to talk partly out of what the experience was of writing this book. I've written books. The last almost kind of trilogy that I did was around events that the education I had got as a social theorist and as a philosophy person didn't really help me understand what was happening. I wrote a book initially on the Diana funeral, which in London was a moment when journalists could no longer understand what was unfolding before their eyes. I then wrote a book on 9/11 and also on the London bombings, which were two events where I had been educated into a certain vision of the social sciences as a tradition of a certain kind of secular rationalism, and I felt I didn't know anything about Islam. It wasn't part of my philosophy training. It would have been seen as religious. It wasn't part of my education. So I had to unlearn or begin to hope to frame a different kind of language in order to begin to think about what was changing. And when Brexit came, the months leading up to Brexit, it was clear that the media, the mass media in part, was so focused upon the leaderships of the two campaigns that they didn't really understand what was unfolding in the country. The level of anger that had been developed against both political parties, who were being framed in some way as a kind of political elite, because for quite a long time since the global financial crisis, there was a kind of feeling with New Labour in Britain that the project of modernisation was the project that a new neoliberal globalised capitalism had created this new reality. And that unless you went along with that reality, you were in some way backward, resistant, because progress meant this neoliberal globalization, and any feeling or resistance to it was met as a kind of backwardness, a backward step. So when the Labour Party opened up in one of the only countries in Europe to the mass migration coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland and the accession countries, there was a feeling that nobody had really been consulted about this shift. New Labour didn't open a dialogue in the country about free movement. And it meant that if anybody kind of challenged or questioned, it would either be taken as xenophobic or potentially racist. So there was a moment developing over time where Labour had lost its relationship to its own working class communities. It didn't know how to speak to them. The language, the political language that was available was a political language that just didn't resonate. And there was a critical moment in 2010 in the general election, when a woman came up who was a traditional Labour voter, who came up to talk to Brown, who was then the Prime Minister, about the changes that were happening in her community. She was a traditional supporter. She wasn't in any way xenophobic. She was concerned about health and education, and she was concerned about the changes that neoliberalism had wrought to the community. And I think this is one of the elements, and this would be wonderful to discuss, where there are resonance with the impact in the US and the impact in the UK. A sense that even shops in local neighbourhoods through which a sense of place had been developed over time, most of those landmarks were closing down. So familiar sense of place and its relationship to democracy, what does it mean to live in a particular area and space? Those communities were being hollowed out almost from the inside. And people who might have wanted to resist it, like this older woman, was caught on mic saying, Brown saying, "Who let that racist woman next to me?" That was a critical moment in British politics that still resonates. He eventually had to apologise. And it was clear that the language and discourses around racism had been used in some way as a silencing framing. It meant that questions about the levels of immigration couldn't really be framed or even thought about or reflected. So when Brexit actually came, and the vote took place, there was a sense of real shock. So I'm going to read bits from the book to just give you a sense of the flavour of some of this, the moment of Brexit. So we'll start with the moment of Brexit and then kind of look back at some of the conditions that helped produce it. Writing about her own experience of waking up to hear the result of the referendum, and most of us were just kind of anxious. This was like 3 or 4 in the morning. The Scottish poet Jackie Kay shares, "I woke up fairly innocently for a few moments, and then the news filtered into my consciousness, and I remember. It's like a bereavement. When you first wake, for the first few seconds, that loved one is still in your world. Then you remember and are distraught. I hadn't realized it would hit me like this. None of us had. It's a trauma, a bloody blow to the country." At breakfast over scrambled eggs on the poetry tour, Shore to Shore, it was a poetry tour that a group of feminist activists were taking around the country. She discussed the latest news with others. The political world is imploding. The whole country, it seems, has been taken for a ride. And that might even resonate with what people feel in the States in relationship, in relationship to Trump. There's a kind of language here where we're trying to frame a political understanding of an unethical understanding of what was going on. No one really wanted to go in the first place, and now even some of the outers are called regret. We already regret our vote the day after because people wanted to vote as an expression of real anger against the inequalities of neoliberalism that had meant that the country had become so divided. They wanted to be able to protest, but they didn't necessarily want to think that Britain would leave the EU. And also there was very little sense of what the consequences of leaving would be. There was no realization really of what the different forms Brexit would take or could take. So the distinctions that were being made between a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit, which were roughly about how close should the UK stay to Europe, which is its largest market, and how distant it could be. And for that, to understand it, you need to take a step back. The empire, you know about the British Empire? It's a kind of familiar term. I think it's helped to shape your history in some way. The empire, which is what I grew up with. So I grew up in the 1945, in that post-war period, through the period of decolonization. And the empire was the framing through which we were taught at school. So I remember my map and my globe was half pink. So you felt, my God. So if you came from a kind of refugee Jewish family that I did, there was a kind of security in identifying with being British or the British Empire. And that empire consciousness shaped a generation. And in Britain, which is in some way has a very different racial experience and history in relationship to slavery and the histories of slavery in the US, so that people could be schooled in Britain without much experience of a multiracial schooling experience. And it was that older generation who somehow framed the resistance, who wanted to leave the EU, and felt that there was a need to return to a kind of empire, almost a kind of nostalgic vision of the empire, where the Commonwealth would somehow be rediscovered, as it was very recently at the Commonwealth Gathering, and that Britain's role, which had been in the post-war period, to enter the EU, to give Britain a different role within a kind of global economy, to be part of a global bloc, which is what the EU represented. And the EU represented a kind of cosmopolitan universal ethic. There was a kind of post-Holocaust framing where the Holocaust in the European context was framed as a new universal ethic that would almost provide the entrance to European Union. And there was a deep ambivalence because it meant that the national histories, particularly in the Baltic states, different parts of Eastern Europe, could just pay deference to this new ethic without really having to deal with its own histories. So the context of Brexit is also about the context of the nation, or how we think of the nation in a post-national globalized world. And Brexit has to be understood in the context of the rise of populism across Europe in a way that the EU is still finding it difficult to really understand. And just in the last week, the Italian election, what's happening in Italy, the challenge of two populist parties that are framed in part at least by a challenge to the EU. There's a way that the EU self-conception was as of a transnational project, a project that was somehow overriding of the nation state. So it meant that people in Britain, particularly in traditional working class communities, but mainly also in the Tory Shire districts in the south, who were always conservative voters and who had long been distant to the EU. So the experience in Britain was that the membership of the European Union was never really adopted. There was always a kind of marginal feeling of a kind of relationship that wasn't really there. And a lot of both political parties found it very difficult to defend, or to defend openly, European values, histories, and cultures. So that the referendum, when it came, was not really a referendum that was ever going to happen. Because when Cameron's coalition was in power and the 2015 election took place, it was clearly seen that there would be a new coalition. But there wasn't. The Tories came in and Cameron was obliged to offer the possibility of a referendum. But the EU didn't understand even the potentiality of the crisis. And there was a kind of opposition between a kind of globalist framing as representing the future, a kind of cosmopolitan ethics of the future, and a kind of deriding as almost nativism and backward people's resistance or relationships to their own communities. So one of the issues was around the deindustrialization in parts of Britain and the moving of various kind of industries out of the country. There was one moment, leading moment, when in the potteries district, a factory was completely undone and removed to China. And there was a feeling of resentment in those communities as to why was this happening? What did it mean that it was happening? So I'm going to read a few more of the Chakrabarti notes, but over the last few months, the men who are now shaping, and it's important that they're men, the question of masculinity and gender was really central to the whole referendum campaign, as are questions around masculinity central to Trump's power and his misogyny and racism. And still, the analysis in terms of men and masculinities, which is here in the book, hasn't been kind of addressed in the way that it should be. Over the last few months, the men who are now shaping Britain's future outside the EU effectively ditched public decency and decided it was okay to be racist. Nigel Farage told Tim Ross of the Sunday Telegraph that voters must consider the security threat posed by the migrant crisis when considering the referendum, and said that the nuclear bomb this time would be about Cologne. Do you remember the incidents in Cologne around Syrian men and questions of sexual violence? So questions of sexual violence were right at the core of what was developing in this framing. There are some very big cultural issues. So the kind of gender and xenophobia was there in the language that was being used. Asked about mass sex attacks on the scale of Cologne could happen in Britain, Farage, who was the leader of one of the key leaders of UKIP, said it depends if they get EU passports. It depends if we vote for Brexit or not. It's an issue. Chakrabarti writes in The Guardian that Michael Keith from the Oxford Centre Compass says, the unspeakable became not only speakable, but commonplace. So there was this moment in the referendum where the racism and xenophobia was really intense. And then there was a moment that everyone in Britain remembers. If you say in Britain, do you remember the moment that Joe Cox got murdered? Everybody in the country carries that memory and carries a feeling that a line had been crossed. On that very day, UKIP presented a poster of a migrant line heading across towards Britain, and a sense of fear that was being framed as part of the referendum. And the lining was breaking point. On that day, Jo Cox was murdered in her constituency, and she was known as a young, progressive Labour MP who had an internationalist orientation and who basically worked in a way to bring multicultural values into her constituency. And in the inscription of the book, Jo Cox, in her maiden speech in the House of Commons that became probably known in the US as it was known in the UK, we are far more united and have far more in common with each other than things that divide us. The moment of her death by a right-wing activist shows the connection to the US right, because the guy who was involved was part of a southern right-wing reactionary group, racist group, and he was reading the US material And so the links across, particularly in terms of the organisation of the political right, are really important to express and explore. So the links with a far-right movement and the links between the referendum and Trump's campaign were made really explicit. And Trump then, when he won the nomination, talked or said this was Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. It was a kind of super Brexit where some of the lessons learnt in the UK, particularly with Farage and the UKIP party, were being shared in the parts of Trump's campaign and Trump's work. So the links across are really important to begin to think about, knowing that there are different colonial and imperial histories between the US and UK. But after the referendum, it was often said that it was because there was a kind of two issues that I want to kind of move to an end with partly, and then open up to questions. One was the issues around generation. There were real generational splits in the country, with a younger generation holding to more cosmopolitan universalist values around ideas which really need to be thought about, which were ideas of no nation, no borders, and a no nation, no borders. And a lot of young activists went to Greece, went to different parts of Europe, and did really important work in relationship to refugees coming into Europe around those issues and around that conception. But there was also a tendency of that younger generation to dismiss as racist everybody who voted for Brexit, not really listen or engage with what they were or what was happening. And part of the book is to frame the questions of inequality as absolutely central to the whole Brexit discussion. That it was the inequality that had developed since the responses to the global financial crisis and the austerity that had been so strongly framed, where it was often the traditional working class areas that suffered most. So the question of inequality framed people's determination that their vote should count. And this is a really kind of interesting framing that I've been trying to think about how it relates to questions of democracy. So if we think back, I was doing this with Larry and Julie a bit, in the early 1970s, and people were living communally and collectively and other things. In what way did we see ourselves as kind of living a different set of democratic values? To what extent was democracy and a sense of democracy as lived an important current that could in some way make connections between then and now? A younger generation is cosmopolitan and universalist, but it's been very difficult to open up a dialogue between those people who voted Remain and those people who voted to leave. And in some way, the UK has been almost frozen in this determination by a lot of people that Brexit should happen. But the motivation for that was linked to the question of inequality. It was linked to the idea that our votes should count. And that in a contrast to a parliamentary election, the idea that each vote would matter meant that the referendum vote and the vote to leave was also an expression of anger and rage at a kind of neoliberal hegemony which had ignored, overlooked, and in some way taken for granted and patronized. So there was a sense that there's an important, for a moment, thinking of a kind of working class uprising of a certain kind. that there was a kind of feeling of resistance that the economy had to be kind of reorganized in a kind of radically different way. So I'm going to finish with a final kind of reading. Zygmunt Bauman, who was a well-known sociologist, just died just after the referendum. But he said something which was really significant. He was reflecting and thinking about the campaign. Bauman says we're living in a state of continuous uncertainty. You feel that every day with Trump. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So there's a different temporality, the temporality of the Twitter account, that becomes part of a kind of accelerated, different kind of uncertainty that people are used to kind of living in and live in relationship to in different generations. We're living in a state of continuous uncertainty which makes us afraid. Wary of a possible Trump presidency, he affirms that security without freedom is slavery. Freedom without security is complete chaos, where you're lost, abandoned, and don't know what to do. Talking of the dangerous times we're living through, he notes, people find themselves uneasy, lost, incapable of acting with certainty, with assurance. And so they turn to politicians who say, in a kind of way of framing a new populist politics, a kind of authoritarian populism, which is really on the march in Europe. Give me the power and I will take responsibility for your future. According to Bauman, such leaders are capitalizing on the feeling that democracy is very strong in its mouth, but not in its deeds. And democracy and the defense of democracy against a Trump presidency can learn from the experience in the UK of Brexit, but can also learn from the ideas stretching back across generations of a discourse of values or alternative values that a younger generation is opening to listen to, possibly for the first time. So there's a need for a dialogue across differences, and in that context, an exploration of a comparison and a dialogue between what's unfolding in the UK and what's unfolding in Europe. The dangerous moment in relationship to the EU as a transnational project is what it means to rethink the relationship between the nation state, human rights, and democracy. So on that note, let's open up for questions. Yeah, I thought it'd be great to try and do most of this in terms of the... do you want to just say who you are?
Oh, my name is Stephen Helfer.
Hi, Steve.
Here in Cambridge. You warned about people using the term racism to silence disagreement at a certain point in your talk. But then at a certain point, you seem to blame a lot of Brexit and the rise of Trump as due to racism and xenophobia. And it seems to be contradictory. How can there be dialogue when one side is labeled racist, xenophobic, misogynist? That seems to cut off any chance of dialogue.
Well, I think you've got to think about it in the specific context that since the Brexit vote, I think people have had to challenge the idea that because people voted for Brexit, that means that they're racist or xenophobic. And I think the book tries to open up to different voices. It tries to open up the possibility of some kind of dialogue and doesn't go along with the idea that people who voted for Brexit should be either dismissed or not or be kind of denigrated in some way as racist, unless it's there in their actions. What happened, and I can read other parts of that, is there were moments when the Brexit result happened, when there was a rise of racist incidents in Britain, and it was pretty scary, and it was very on the in front of our attention. And it was the idea that because the vote had somehow been taken, people should leave almost the next day. So there was there were strong racist elements that were part of the Brexit campaign, and it's important to identify those racist and xenophobic elements. What isn't right is a kind of general blanketing, and that's what the book contests. It says, no, this is much more complicated, and you've got to listen to these very different kinds of voices. Do you want to just say your name?
My name is Martin Harrison.
Hi,
I
Martin.
live in Boston.
Great.
Well, I mean, I would sort of reinforce what you said. I think I'm sure we all hate Trump in this room, and he's a vile person. But I think analysis of the election showed that Trump lost because 50,000 voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, states that had been tending toward the Democratic Party for years, who had voted for Barack Obama, voted for Trump. So it's sort of, you know, again, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you. To blame, no doubt there are many racists who support Trump, but that's not it wasn't because of the alienation in Idaho or southern racists in Georgia. It was because northern Democrats essentially decided that Trump was working more in their interests than Hillary Clinton was.
Yeah.
So I mean, so what I'm saying.
No, absolutely.
I agree. It's very complicated. You can't,
There was a moment that just came out in this book on the Obama campaign that announced that Obama, who was shocked by the results because they'd assumed that Clinton was going to win, recognized that they had themselves in the Obama campaign seen the Clintons as part of an establishment, so they couldn't be a mover for change. And I think that was an element in the US election. In the UK situation, what was interesting, and the book does this, the book doesn't just go to the referendum, it takes it right the way through to the general election last year. And what was interesting is that a lot of people who felt that their vote for the Brexit vote was a vote of real anger and resistance, turned towards the Labour Party and Corbyn's Labour Party because they saw for the first time the possibilities of some kind of real change in the British economy. So that there were certain elements about social inequality that a Corbyn Labour Party, for at least the younger generation, was seen as a kind of sign of hope. And that was part of a kind of movement that the book traces in the general election. But Corbyn was also very uncertain in terms of the relationship to the EU. So the relationship, and a lot of younger people felt very angry at the Labour Party for not being clearer in its position to remain in the EU. And that is a key issue, particularly in metropolitan areas, particularly in London and Manchester. But these are often the areas that have benefited from a kind of globalization. There are splits between that and smaller towns and cities that I tried to kind of focus on, where the impact of the deindustrialization and what it's meant for the hollowing out of any sense of community, that also needs to be part of the argument. So it was very clear in the Remain campaign that people assumed that it would go the same way as the Scottish referendum, which is that if you threaten people with a sense that economically you're going to be worse off, then people are going to vote to Remain. And Obama came to Britain, as did the head of the World Bank and a number of kind of establishment figures, to warn people on the line of the economic argument. But there were other arguments that are not just about the economy that proved decisive, which are around questions of belonging and rootedness and what that means and how we're going to think about that in terms of a new vision of kind of political psychology and a kind of moral politics. So the ideas of that they didn't really understand or grasp what was happening in terms of the resistance to the kind of political elites, particularly after what was called the expenses scandal in 2011, when it looked like the people were helping themselves and there was one law for the parliamentarians and another law for everybody else. So that feeling, as it does, developed over quite a long period of time. And then the anger at the social inequality and the anger that was being expressed, which was in part class anger, was framed through the referendum campaign in a really important and powerful way. Marcia?
Marcia Plum. I live in Needham. So 2 questions. One is, almost everyone I speak to in England wishes, regrets, is terribly upset about Brexit. But no one, everybody seems to just shrug their shoulders and say it's going to happen and that's the way it is. And no one seems to be raising up about it or following Tony Blair's line and saying let's have a second referendum, or challenging the fact that facts were given that were misleading, like the NHS, and nobody seems to be challenging it. Everybody just seems to have just accepted this is the way it is. And I'm curious about why you think that is.
Right.
And the second one is, when we look at Italy, for example, and other countries in Europe, do you think that Brexit signals the end of a transnational Europe and really signals the beginning of a return to pre-World War II Europe?
Well, in Britain at the moment, it's right, there's a kind of stalemate situation, but there's a kind of awareness that it's moving towards some kind of crisis moment. So there have been decisions in the House of Lords in order to make sure that the Parliament has a kind of vote in relationship to the Brexit vote. So there are lots of moves and lots of groups. And the question was what the status of a second referendum would be. And the concern, and Corbyn's concern, was that it could be, as it was, incredibly divisive. And it was said that this was a once-in-a-lifetime vote. So it's really important and difficult to think about in terms of democracy and democratic theory. What does it mean for people to change their minds? So as you say, a lot of people in Britain have changed their minds. How do they express the possibility that they've changed their minds? They now know much more, and there's a very strong feeling that the way the referendum campaign was handled meant that people didn't realise what the consequences were going to be. So I think that feeling is around, but there is a kind of, at the moment, this kind of stalemate as to whether you could go for a second referendum, and some people are trying to campaign for it, but it's kind of unsure. I think it's a really unstable moment in the next 2 or 3 months. There are questions about the Irish border which have been proved really important, the question of the Irish border and whether you could have a border. There are splits in the Tory party, and there are splits between those who see a notion of kind of Britain being free to negotiate this older imperial vision as if the world hasn't changed in a radical way. And there are a lot, including businesses and other organisations, saying, no, Britain has to stay in relationship to the EU. And there's also a younger generation who feel like the freedom to make relationships, the freedom to love and have relationships with people across Europe, and the way that London has already become a world globalized cosmopolitan city can't be undone, and they want to stay and fight for it. So I think there's still a lot of things to play for in it. In terms of Europe and what's happening in Europe, there was a certain kind of interpretation of the EU that with Macron's election in France and the failure of Wilders in Holland, that the tide had somehow, the populist tide had somehow turned. And I think that was a radical misreading. I think it was almost a tragic misreading, because it meant that the EU didn't have to rethink its own philosophical and ethical basis. And it didn't have to think about what Europe and the values of Europe and how they could be expressed. So I think it's not necessarily helpful to think about a return or from a transnational to a national. I think the question is what can be envisioned as a kind of a more democratically accountable Europe, where some sense of the nation state is kind of recognized and valued, because if you don't do that, you get the rise of kind of right-wing authoritarian and fascist politics. Now, a question that is a question for us in this room, that challenges us in some way, is the questions about identity. Because it's been raised in the post-Trump that somehow Clinton lost because the Democratic Party had moved to some kind of identity politics in some way. I think it's nonsense, but that's the kind of framing. So in Europe, what's interesting, though, is that the left has kind of lost confidence in how to think about identity. And the right, particularly in Europe and particularly in Austria, but in other, have claimed the language of identity as its own. They've claimed a kind of national sense of identity. And it's very clear in the States that, just kind of listening and trying to analyze some of the Bannon speeches, there's the appeal to a certain kind of nationalism. It's different in the States than it is in UK, and it'd be really interesting to explore it, where the nation, somehow the American nation, is seen as somehow inclusive of race, gender, even though Trump has been so violently misogynist and xenophobic. But there's something in the nationalist project which is really dangerous and is a framing back to the 1930s. And I don't think you can... So I think the contrast between globalism and nativism is kind of unhelpful. And we need new categories to think about it.
Naomi Schumann, I live in Arlington. Lurking around all of this is something that increasingly has been sort of baffling me for a whole range of different reasons. And that's trying to figure out what in the world Europe is. I mean, for a start, it's not a continent. Despite being the continent, it isn't a continent. It's a political, fantasy that's become reality. It had to get created. And the question of nationalisms, both within Europe as against a pan-European identity, but then there's also Fortress Europe against the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering about sort of poised in the middle between nations on the one hand and more global perspectives on the other. There's this thing called Europe, and I don't quite know what it is, except it's clearly enormously important, and it's very, very real, despite having been created. I mean, lots of created things are real. And what the meaning of it is, the values that it embodies, but the deeply problematic nature of its creation, which I think is horribly compromised. So I'm wondering, I mean, the question what's going to become of Europe is bound up with what in the world was it in the first place? And what's
Yeah.
the point of it? And what is it?
Well, in its creation as a myth, there's also a politics of both memory and forgetting. So Europe as a mythical production is in relationship to the Holocaust and the Second World War. And the difficulty of speaking about the Holocaust and the Second World War. So Europe's response at the gates of Auschwitz is silence. And silence doesn't produce a strong ethic. So you discover in a project that I was involved in on second and third generation memory in Germany. This is a project that's now a book by Alice Hohenlohe. It was about the creation of Europe in the face of the Holocaust and the difficulties of really dealing with national histories. So the appeal to a transnational set of values, and this is why I think question about values is so important, and which is why I started, what does it mean for values to be lived? So if the value is of silence, and you have this in Germany, people talk about it, you have a day of silence and then everything goes back to normal. So there's no real engagement then of the histories and the very complicated histories in Europe. So I also started with the kind of post-war framing in Britain. And if you noticed, like just the movies, because movies seem to be like the key cultural moment in the States, but if you see movies like Dunkirk and Churchill, both quite successful post-Brexit movies, framing a kind of national history, it meant that Britain never bought in some way, partly for the reasons that you're saying, to this mythical conception of European values, because in Britain there was a different kind of need to forget a colonial history. And Britain has never really dealt with the histories of slavery and colonialism. It's a kind of uneasy memory that people don't really know how to deal with. So given that in Britain you've got that forgetting, in Europe there are kind of discussions or trying to understand, well, what is Europe? How is Europe? Because Europe has these such different histories. And then there have been attempts to, say, identify post-Soviet transition states that were under Soviet hegemony as somehow equivalent to Nazi domination of, so there's kind of these false equivalences that can only be made because these national histories have not really had to be dealt with. And the EU has said, look, if you sign on the dotted line that you adopt this new transnational ethics, then you can become part of the EU. But at the same time, there's this either romanticizing of the past, of a kind of ethnicized past, or there's a kind of refusal to really engage with these kind of difficult and very painful European histories. And I think a younger generation doesn't necessarily want to go there, doesn't necessarily feel that it has to. But the way that Europe has dealt with post-war memory, with the exception in some way Germany has done that much more. So if you go to Germany, there is a feeling that people have really worked on something, and the younger generation in Germany is both kind of active and European because it's engaged with its own history. If you go to Austria, which presented itself as the first victim of Nazism, my mother came from Vienna, and she continually felt kind of bitter that the history that she had lived through was completely denied by the government and the state. And it was only in the 90s that Vienna started to begin to engage with its history. Well, it's in Vienna and Austria that the notion of identity has been claimed by the right. So the authoritarian populism, which is different from a kind of ethnic populism, but there's kind of interesting framings. In what's happened in Austria, you can see a different kind of right-wing government framing. So those histories are, of the histories of the oppressed are in some way returning in cultural and historical forms. And the EU is strangely bureaucratic and strangely unable to engage its own histories because it's so tied to that myth, and that myth becomes so much more important. But I think in the next 3 or 4 years, we really need, and philosophers and social theorists need to be thinking about the question about, well, what is Europe and what is democracy in Europe? Because there's the idea of a European Parliament, but it's so distant that people in Britain have never really identified with it.
One or two more short questions.
My name is Nick Ironstein. I'm just curious, you talked a lot about the kind of frustration and the anger that led to some of the votes for Brexit. And I think we get the sense in this country, too, that there's this growing divide between both sides. And you also alluded to the lack of dialogue, or unwillingness to talk to each other. How do you then open up that dialogue between two sides when there's so much anger? How do you kind of use that into engagement and discussion with each other when both sides feel so strongly about something so differently?
That's a really good question. There have been small experiments of bringing people together in the same space. And some of those have been within the context of the media, so that even though they've happened in a small space, they've then been kind of more widely distributed. And people in those contexts have kind of had to hear. So I think there's something about, and the book does this a bit, about listening. As sociologists aren't very good listeners. They think they can explain things. And philosophers are often tied into a certain kind of rationalist discourse of reasons for action. And so they're not necessarily very good listeners. So I think there's a kind of need, and it was very clear that only a few journalists actually went out and were prepared to kind of listen and hear what was going on. And I've tried to incorporate them into the book, so that the book is in some way a possibility of opening a certain kind of dialogue. But you need to be able to kind of think much more, very fundamentally about what the futures are. And it's clear since the referendum that things have got clearer. People have become clearer about the deceptions and the lies.
Of the other side.
Of the other side, of both sides.
Always of the other side.
No, well, it's partly of the other side, but I think there's some shifting taking place. I think Remainers have actually been in some way more intolerant of being able to kind of think out, because the notion of a cosmopolitan ethic always trumps a kind of particularistic, localized rootedness or belonging. And I think those questions, the questions about the impact of questions of issues of belonging and how people are going to engage them, I think are going to be really important.
Yeah, Rich Levy from Brookline. You had started by talking about this neoliberal project, and all what you're talking about is the complexities of different histories of Europe, different countries in Europe is really an important factor.
Yeah.
What I keep coming back to is Margaret Thatcher's comment, there is no alternative. Neoliberalism is it, and as you said, any opposition to that is retro and bad. But this is a neoliberal project that's been incorporated both in Europe, in London, as I understand it.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party and most of the Labour Party, at least until Corbyn, has included most of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And this anger is against that growing inequality, which in many ways Macron is an intensification of, rather than a break with. And this anger has been co-opted in many ways by a nationalist / ethnic racist misogynist, retro, let's go back to an ideal white male dominant place that never really existed.
Yeah.
So that the importance of saying not everybody who did that is racist is really critical both here and
Yeah.
in Europe, but it has at the same time encouraged and given room to those truly racist elements that are there.
Yeah.
And one just example in response to what the gentleman in front of me just asked, of how do you talk about it? One simple example I saw, Bernie Sanders went into, I think it was Kentucky, in a hostile audience, and basically tried to say the sources of this inequality are not ethnic or immigration or
Yeah.
ethnicity, but have to do with structural neoliberalism. And it's a very complex argument, but he was actually well received.
It was actually,
Well received
yeah.
in that audience.
No, I think you say it really beautifully, clearly. But I think the way that the issue is whether Thatcher's vision of there is no alternative, neoliberalism is here, is what New Labour adopted. And because New Labour adopted it, and it was this kind of universalist cosmopolitan ethic that goes along with it, it blocked out and silenced, because anybody who stood in its way was regressive. So if you frame it in that way, you can think that the Brexit vote was in some way a kind of uprising against the inequalities produced through that neoliberalism. And if that's true, which I think it is, then it's very important to both recognise the racism xenophobia as part of, but not make that the explanation for Brexit or the explanation for Trump. But then the questions around what are the viable alternatives to neoliberalism, what form or new forms of political economy are framed, become vital moral concerns and questions. And I think that's where we're at. We're having to need. Now, one way in which, and Sanders is different from Corbyn in the UK. There's the way that Corbyn is framed, or possibly isn't that different. Corbyn is in some way framed through a kind of leftist 70s framing that finds some of the changes, particularly of technologies, which we've hardly talked about, the way in which technology has completely transformed the nature of political discussion and debate, both generationally but also across generation. But the questions then around that Labour is trying in Britain to shape, and a younger generation is trying, are questions about what are the viable alternatives to neoliberalism, and how do we build kind of in opposition and against them. But I think those questions about neoliberalism are also to do with questions which I started with, which were questions of alternative values. Because a younger generation is asking questions about different values that people can live with, not just as academic values, but as values as forms of community. So in Britain, we've got this project called the Mayday Room, which brings an archive of different generations' materials together. And in that context, there are people working as cleaners in offices, which is being unionized, but not by traditional unions, but a bit like by Latin American workers' unions are forming these new international workers' organizations, in some way with a politics which is in some way more libertarian, but not libertarian in the kind of right-wing sense, but a kind of libertarian left tradition is beginning to re-emerge as a way of framing a question of democratic values. But we don't know where we're going to be. So I'm going to finish on this last reading of this inscription, of my two. This is from Maya Angelou. If we lose love and self-respect for each other, this is how we finally die. And my last quote, which comes from Rabbi Eliezer, and I wasn't sure why I put this in or how I put it in, but since the referendum, it's really spoken to me. When a tree that bears fruit is cut down, its mown goes from one end of the world to the other, yet no sound is heard. There are no sounds, there's resistance, but the challenging of the neoliberalism is part of the language, a new moral and political language that we need to create, and hopefully the book is a small gesture in that direction.